Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 62 verse 1 from the New King James Bible says this: Truly my soul silently waits for God. From him comes my salvation. I'm with Rafi Bonker from the Indian Jewish Heritage Centre. Now, Rafi, what is the Indian Jewish Heritage Centre?
Good morning. The Indian Jewish Heritage Center is basically a vision at this point. It is an actual location, but it's a vision. If you look at all the heritage centers that exist for the smaller Jewish communities around Israel, there are Jewish heritage centers for places like the Jews of Libya, Egypt, Ethiopia, Yemen, Morocco, but there is no Indian Jewish Heritage Center. There is, I must say, there's 4 different Jewish communities that lived in India, or some of them still do. And one of the communities, the Kochini community, does have a heritage center for the last 30 years, I must say, in Nevatim, next to Beersheba. So our organization, the Indian Jewish Heritage Center, which was formed 15 years ago, connected with the Kochini Jewish Heritage Center with the intention of building a complex. That's our vision, a complex of Indian Jews, all the Jewish communities in India in that location. We have the site, we have the land, we have the vision. We're actually doing a lot of activities, but we're still looking to actually make that vision a reality in the next few years.
So is this a place where you're wanting local Jews to come and learn about the Jewish Indian culture?
I should say not just Jews, local Jews, but just anyone who wants to understand and get familiar with this unfamiliar Jewish community or communities, I must say. You know, I lived in the US for many years, and when people realized that I was Jewish and I look Indian, was, well, how does that make sense? I mean, Jews in India, that didn't make sense to anyone. And that's true probably for most people outside Israel. And even in Israel, if you're an Indian, people know in Israel that there are Jews that came from India, but they have no clue that these are different Jewish communities, the Bnei Menashe, the Baghdadi, the Bnei Israel, the Kochini. These are 4 different communities. And, you know, India is a subcontinent and it's huge. So the intention really is to make sure that people get familiar and understand the complexity and the rich heritage that all these communities have in India.
Yeah, you don't really imagine Jews being in India. Are there a lot of Jews in India today?
Well, today the Bnei Israel community probably is the largest community that has significant 4,000 Jews approximately. The Kochini community has about 25. I learned that last week when we had a birthright group from youngsters who came from India, and I hosted them at my home. And I asked, there was one individual, there was a total of 24, and one individual was from the Kochini community. So I asked, and it's 25. The Baghdadis basically left at Indian independence in 1947. And that's also when the other communities started to move. The Bnei Menashe community is actually a little different because they, in the last 50 or 60 years, have been recognized as a community, one of the potentially lost tribes, and they've asked for migration to Israel. 5,000 made it to Israel, and there's 5,000 Bnei Menashe community that are asking for and requesting and waiting for approval for migration.
You know how many Indian Jews are in Israel today? And do they stay in the same community, the same area?
First of all, they're spread all over. So there are certain areas like Ashdod and Ramli Lud, Beersheba, Dimona, the areas, suburbs of Haifa that have a little larger groups, but they're really all over Israel. And then to answer your first question, that's interesting because the question is, how do you define an Indian Jew? Because as you probably know, Israel, very similar to the US, is a melting pot. And so Jews have migrated from various countries to Israel. And the policy has always been, you know, you're now Israeli and you have an Israeli identity and you're all one. And so the question is whether you count the individuals who were born in India and live in Israel, whether you look at the individuals whose kids are of both parents who are from India. What about mixed marriages? So the number, to give you an estimate, is about 85,000 individuals in Israel who I say would be either from Indian origin or their children, if you count their children from Indian origin. A number to mention is probably 20,000, which is what the population of Indian Jews was in 1948, not including the Bnei Menashe, the Baghdadi community, the Bnei Menashe community, the Baghdadi, the Kochini, and the Bnei Israel community. If you take those three, with the majority being the Bnei Israel, was 20,000 in 1948, before the founding of the State of Israel.
Jews in India keep their Jewish identity even though they're in India?
Absolutely, yes. And I think, similar to the Christian communities there in India, these communities are incredibly ancient, especially the Bnei Israel and the Malabari Kochini Jews. These communities, the Baghdadis came to India 200 years ago, so that's a different group. But these two communities are very ancient. There are no records, so it's difficult to know whether, what year exactly, or whether they came in waves, which is probably more probable. But very similar to the Christian community, they're very ancient. They lived peacefully with their neighbors. There's no anti-Semitism. Tolerance was very normal. Actually, we're trying to set up some kind of event here in Israel, which expresses that tolerance and shares that idea here in Israel later this year. So absolutely, they lived in the communities. They integrated. They had distinct religious identities, but there was cultural syncretism. They basically, their dress. My father, actually, because he was more national and against the British, he wore Indian dress, even though it wasn't common for Jews. So the dress, ladies wore saris, which is the common dress for ladies in India. So music, architecture, if you look at the architecture and so on. So they were very much integrated into the society, but they did keep a very distinct set of religious identities and traditions.
What is some of the distinct Indian identity of the Jewish community? What sort of things would you say?
Well, it starts from simple things like, obviously having the circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, keeping the holidays. I studied in a Christian school, but whenever there was a Jewish holiday like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or the New Year, Passover, and so on, all I needed was a note from my parents, and I was at home, either with the family or at the synagogues. And there's 17 synagogues. Most of them are not active anymore, but in Bombay, many also in the South. So, we did keep our traditions. We did keep our holidays. We did keep food in terms of the kosher. It was kept to a degree, again, as the oral tradition required. Marriages, brits, the circumcisions, and all of these ceremonies were maintained. They were unique, and the people got together. The synagogue was a central location for these events, and that's when people got together and stayed together. Here, I must mention something. You talked about unique. It also expressed itself in different ways. For instance, in the Bnei Israel community that lived in Bombay, their language, most people also spoke English, of course, just like most Indians, educated Indians, I should say. But the Bnei Israel, for instance, spoke Marathi, which is the national language of the state of Maharashtra. The Kochini Jews spoke Malayalam, which is the national language for the state of Kerala. But if you look, there is a Jewish Malayalam, there is a Jewish Marathi, which is a slightly different dialect in very subtle ways. So even though they did speak the local languages, you see that there are certain aspects which kind of showed that, they were connected, and they used certain words, where they got things from probably Hebrew or old traditions, which made them unique. This is just one example.
Now, I see that there's anti-Semitism rising around the world. Has the Jewish community in India always been very respected and felt welcome in India?
Anti-Semitism has never been an issue in India. And even today, I think most of the Indian population identify and see Israel in favorable terms. If you look at the trade relations, if you look at the exchange of cultures and so on, it is very common. It is very respected There's mutual respect. And I think that, if in the past, probably 50, when the state was born, India didn't recognize Israel as a state initially. So it wasn't obvious, but there was no anti-Semitism. But in the last 30, 35 years, the countries have gotten much closer. So Jews in general and Israel is very well respected and accepted in the community. There is the anti-Semitism that we're seeing across different places around the world does not express itself in India.
Now, are Jews in India today from AD 70, when the Jews were dispersed from the Holy Land? Is that how they're there in India today?
So the answer is a little complicated. You have to take each community and see where they came from and then look at records, which in most cases don't exist. So if you look, the easiest is the Baghdadi community, right? They came as part of the British trade in probably 1830, 1840, part of the trade that they had. And they were also having issues with or Jewish problems in Iraq and in certain places in the Middle East. And they migrated to India. And they were very unique because they got their own traditions. They spoke Arabic initially 200 years ago. They gradually moved to English. So that's very well recorded, or relatively well recorded, because it was recent. When you look at the Bene Israel community, that is a very ancient community, and there are no records past about 300 years ago. So what you have before is you see that there are oral traditions that are still kept that make the community unique. That's how they were identified 300 years ago, because they kept certain things in their diet and circumcision and holidays and so on. So you see that, and that's how they express their connection to Judaism. So it's unknown whether they came as a group at a certain point. Their history shows that, they tell a story, origin story, about 7 men and 7 women that were shipwrecked the coast of the Konkan, which is close south of Bombay. And then they were welcomed locally, and then they lived there and so on. But again, they didn't have any of their belongings, so they didn't have the Bible and so on. So everything was oral. That's the origin myth. But whether they came as a group, whether they came individually over the years in waves, is unknown. Similar situation is with the Kochini Jews, because the original, there are actually 2 groups there. They're the Malabari Kochini Jews that have a very similar history. They believe that they came at the time of King Solomon. Now, whether that's true or whether they came in waves and so on is unclear, but it's clear that there are a group that lived there for many, many years, long before the Portuguese came there 500 years ago. And then there was a new group of Kochini Jews that arrived, and they're called the Paradesi Jews. Now, Paradesi in local language means foreigner. So there's 2 groups of Kochini Jews. There's the original Malabari, and then there are the Paradesi, which are the more modern. And they did have different synagogues, so they lived separately. So there's more evidence of the Paradesi just because they came as part of Portugal, and then later there were records, and there's records in Amsterdam and so on, because of that migration. And when you look at the Bene Menashe group, there's absolutely no historic records, and there's more oral tradition as to whether they're part of the lost tribes and they came to China and then moved to India, and there they became Christian. And then just in the last 50, 60 years is when they started returning back to their roots. So it's very difficult to pinpoint. There's minimal research too. This is one of the things we're trying to encourage, is to have more research on the subject to find out more. But it's complex, and that's exactly what I was saying before, is people, think about Jews in India as one group, one community, but it's obviously much more complex, where their origins are, what their traditions are, where they live, what language they spoke, and so on.
What are you wanting people to see in the Indian Jewish Heritage Center?
We want to make that a place where we can do 2 things. On one hand, we want to make sure that we preserve the history, the traditions, the culture, the knowledge, just the fact that, this is what happened. This is where we are. Like I was saying before, Israel is a melting pot. People are no longer just identified, or people don't intermarry within the communities. My wife is not with Indian roots. So again, I want to make sure that my kids and my grandkids can go to a place and experience what it meant to be a Jew in India. So that's one part, that's preservation. The second part is the ability to express the connection to India and Indian Jews. And maybe a good example of that is just 2 days ago, I was at the museum, the Cochin Museum, which is where we're actually setting up a new project with like a VR experience of synagogues in India. So we want to be able to enable people to get a feel for what it was to be at a synagogue, a Baghdadi synagogue or a Kochini synagogue or a Bene Israel synagogue in India with the tunes in the background and some stories. So when we were there, I have a new member of the Indian Jewish Heritage Center group, and I took him along with me. And his mom was from Cochin. His dad was not Indian with the Indian Jewish heritage, but he was born in Israel, and he was there, 50 years old. He, no connection other than maybe a few stories from his mom. And when he was at the museum, it was a great experience for him because he was surrounded with artifacts, with the dress, the traditions, the synagogue. There's an example of a synagogue there. Amazing. So, all of a sudden he connected to his roots. So we want to be able to give people that connection. We want to be able to give them the ability to come and tell their story. And maybe one more thing with regards to what we want to do with this center, and that is to be able to tell the story of, have a place where we can tell the story of the Indian Jews, where that story can be taken to other places through institutions, around in Israel and around the world. I mean, we're doing that already. There is a museum called the Anu Museum, which has the history of all the Jewish communities around the world in Tel Aviv, actually the Tel Aviv campus. That's where it is housed. Through the Hebrew University, through the Haifa University, we're having conferences. We're doing things where we can tell the story, but we want the Heritage Center to be the place where we can create those stories. We can get people to have the ability to make that connection so they can share this experience and the story of Indian Jews that hasn't been highlighted or hasn't even been mentioned outside the community itself.
Now, I understand that there is a Jewish bakery in India as well.
There is. You're referring to a specific bakery in Calcutta, which was from the Baghdadi community. And by the way, it's very common for Jews and actually also Christians who lived in India. I mean, these are minorities in a vastly Hindu state, where I think both these communities, the Christian community, the Jewish community, the Parsi community, by the way, is another one. All of their activities, there were many, many individuals who took initiative and started businesses and were in prominent places in government and so on. So there's like a mayor of Bombay at one time in the 1930s was from Bene Israel community. There was a very famous poet whose Nissim Ezekiel, whose songs and poems are still taught in school in the general curriculum in India. So, and this bakery is an example, again, of an initiative by a Baghdadi Jew starting a bakery in Calcutta back, I guess, over 100 years ago. Very famous bakery that many people came to. And it's, again, part of a tradition of the Jews, the Jewish minorities and the Christian minorities and the Parsi minorities really to excel in the things that they do to express their connection to the land, the bakery obviously bakes things that are for locals, but with the traditions that they came from and their culture and background.
Now, do Indian Jews have special foods, and are you wanting to teach on foods? And do they also have special clothings as well?
You mean the Indian Jews in India?
Yes.
Okay. I think, again, it depends on two things. It depends on the community. So I think the Baghdadi Jews wore Western dresses and so on all along. From the day they arrived, again, they were very connected to the British. That's how they came to India. So maybe they still, the first generation still had, the Muslim turbans or whatever, because that's where they came from. They came from the Arab land. The Bene Israel and the Kochinis were very much, again, since we don't know exactly when they came, they were very much integrated into the local population And in terms of their dress and so on, it was very much according to the local customs. So ladies wore saris, which is the common dress for ladies in India. Men, initially local dress, and gradually Western dress and so on. But it also varies in terms of the age group. So yes, the older generation, the previous generations, 50, 100 years ago, they were much more with the local customs and local dress. Gradually, with the arrival of the British in India, it changed to more Western for the men. Okay, the women still were in saris, not the Baghdadis. They were always Western, also for the ladies. And then if you look at the younger generation today of the Jews that still live, they're modern. I mean, they're just like any other youngster around the world. They're wearing Western dresses and so on. So it varies by dress and also by the communities. Again, it's complex. India is, or the Indian Jews, just like the Indian subcontinent in general. I mean, India has a lot of different states, different traditions in every state, different climates and different languages. And the Indian Jewish communities have that same complexity depending on where physically they were located.
Now, where is the Indian Jewish Heritage Center going to be located?
We're going to be connecting, or we're actually connected to the Kochini Jewish Heritage Center, which exists for probably about 30 years now in a place called Nevatim, which is 5-minute or 10-minute drive from Beersheba. So we actually have an allocation of land for building the heritage complex already, and we're just in the process of getting the funding we already have some, and it's a process. It'll take some time, but we've started the activities that will then be migrated to that location. An example of that would be we've started a project to collect information about Indian Jews or all the different communities in an archive, in a central archive that we will then, of course, have available. Initially, the idea is to start a digital archive, which will make it easy because we don't have a physical location yet large enough to accommodate the actual items. So we're planning to start, we've just started that process. We're going to get the community connected with experts in archiving we've made contact with. And there are so many different collections that exist with people. And we want to make sure that information, goes back to our goal of preservation. Is not to have it lost, because the older generation, as some of them pass away, that information, all the knowledge that they have with the younger generation, which may not be as interesting to them, we want to have a location where we can keep that. So that will be at the physical location. But in the meantime, just so we don't lose that information for future generations, we've started a digital archiving project, which again will be hosted there, in addition to a number of other activities, including, and like I said, the idea with the Jewish Heritage Center is not just for local individuals who came from India or have roots in India, but really for the entire population. So there will be different things, activities that, relate to India and the tolerance and so on, things that are very common in India, and provide an ability to take that knowledge, the knowledge of India in general and the Jewish communities, and share that with the population in India. A place for conferences, a place for sessions, and we're planning a garden where we can have trees that are from India with special medicinal value, and all of this in a physical location.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about the work that you're doing?
That's a good point. We're actually in the process of renewing the website or renovating the website. The website currently is not as updated, but if you just type in Indian Jewish Heritage Center, you'll basically get to the location, and you click on the link and you can get to our website.
And Rafi, thank you very much for sharing today.
You're more than welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.